Welcome to the final of the 4 sessions which make up the Hong Kong Visa Application Roadmap series, a step-by-step guide to making any kind of Hong Kong visa application and used in conjunction with the extensive free resources contained in the Hong Kong Visa Handbook. If you've gotten this far in the series, it's not really worth making the point again, but I will. My name is Stephen Barnes, co-founder of the Hong Kong Visa Centre. In this very last session, we're going to look at the process of actually getting your Hong Kong visa application started and discuss the practicalities of managing your case after its formal consideration by the Hong Kong ID has actually begun. In this respect, we'll be looking at the methods of getting your application out of the starting gate, using the roadmap to record the ongoing progress as it unfolds in the wake of its formal submission, the kind of interactions you can expect to be having with a Hong Kong ID while they consider your application, and once the case is finalised, what happens next, approval or denial. In order to set the scene for the information about to follow, I want to share with you a case example from our files which sheds a little light on how the process of submitting and managing a Hong Kong visa case is typically experienced, even though, of course, no two cases are ever the same. Our clients were UK citizens. He was an RFID engineer and his wife was a marketing expert. They had an interesting business plan to use Hong Kong as a hub for a new business manufacturing and distributing a radio frequency identity device to be incorporated into consumer electronics, working seamlessly with smartphones. Their intention was to complete the prototype in Taiwan, manufacture it in China, and then manage the business through Hong Kong. They were both visitors to Hong Kong, although his wife had many years previously held an employment visa as part of an earlier career before she'd married in the UK. Their business plan was an interesting one, although it wasn't incredibly well funded. They had sufficient funds to finance their business in Hong Kong for the first 6 months of operations, which is typically sufficient for the purpose of an investment visa, but most of their capital had already been expanded on the R&D and prototype development work undertaken in Taiwan. When they came to us, we had a long discussion about the pros and cons of the submission methodology for their application and settled on an entry visa application. What this means is that we would make the application whilst they were physically outside of Hong Kong and promote the contention that their business planning was principally being undertaken pro forma. In this regard, we would set out for the Hong Kong Immigration Department exactly what the clients intended to do once their visas were approved, and allow the Hong Kong ID to rule on their case as though they were not yet landed in the HKSAR, so they didn't need to satisfy some of the more stringent requirements of the investment visa provability test. For example, taking immediately positive steps towards establishing business premises or recruiting employees early on in the piece as the business plan, post-approval, called for. This approach was really necessitated by the fact that whilst the prototype was almost ready, it had been subject to several months of delays in Taiwan as they sought to overcome an unforeseen engineering challenge. This had already eaten into their reserves of capital and meant that they didn't have too much excess money beyond the first 6 months of operating expenses to fund the Hong Kong plan. So, even though as UK citizens they could have easily sat out the 2 to 3 months case processing time with their 180-day period of stay as visitors, it made more sense for them to apply whilst they were outside of Hong Kong, which we did, submitting the application directly to the 24th floor Entry Employment Investment section, and their intention was to stay close to the action in Taiwan as the prototype neared completion. And if the timing lined up nicely, they'd have their investment visa approved in Hong Kong at about the same time as they were ready to tool up for manufacturing at the factory in China, which they'd already contracted with. After submission, the normal process played itself out. About 10 days later, we received an official acknowledgement of receipt card from the Hong Kong ID, with the case reference number included. 10 days or so after that, we got a veritable laundry list requesting further and better particulars of our client's business plans for Hong Kong and next level detail of supplementing the quite considerable information and documentation that had been included in the original application bundle. One key element of the Hong Kong ID request was proof of source of funds, as well as their amounts. As our clients had been active in Taiwan, Hong Kong, China and the UK since they'd started work on the product, they had bank accounts scattered across these 4 countries, and each account contained an element of the funding that they would need for the purposes of their business plan. This meant that the Hong Kong ID's request for updated information was, certainly in the case of China, slightly problematic, as it was not always possible to get an updated statement due to a lack of internet banking facilities on the accounts. Another curveball which was thrown into the case consideration process mix related to the sponsor of their application, an eminent professor at a Hong Kong university. As the technical aspects of the application were extremely complex to fathom, it became apparent that the Hong Kong ID needed to be able to rely on the express testimony of someone forming part of the application who was professionally qualified to speak to the validity of the engineering concept and also its significant potential in the marketplace once they had moved on to production. As a result, the Hong Kong ID came back and asked our client's sponsor to provide a professional opinion as to the engineering and commercial merits, which he did, and this box was ultimately ticked and the case progressed further forward. In addition, we received 3 calls out of the blue from the immigration officer tasked with the application, who wanted us to confirm a point and supply updated information. All told, we counted 7 discrete sets of submissions and interactions with the Hong Kong ID on this case before it went on to approval. And then, to complete the process, we collected the approved visa labels from the Hong Kong ID on behalf of our client, couried them to Taiwan, and coordinated their arrival dates in Hong Kong so that we could make the appointments for their Hong Kong ID cards the day after they arrived with their new residence visas. As always, as we work our way through this last section of the roadmap, I'll often refer you to the specific resources contained in the Hong Kong Visa Handbook, which discuss in considerable detail the factors which you need to take into consideration in relation to the visa type that you're applying for. In the Apply section, the key resource you'll need to consult is that named How to Apply. In this regard, it's this section of the handbook and the roadmap taken together which will be the key to effectively managing your case after it's been submitted. As we saw in day 1 of the roadmap series, pretty early on in the piece, you'll have to make a decision about how to get your application started, either in person at the Immigration Tower, or by mail via receipt and dispatch on the 2nd floor, or via the Chinese diplomatic mission closest to where you live, if you prefer. If you've decided to submit your application using this last method, be aware that no processing is undertaken on your application at the Chinese consulate itself. Almost all files are referred back to Immigration Tower in Wan Chai, so you're actually better off just submitting your application to the department directly, bypassing the postbox role which the Chinese consular authorities play. Whichever application method you do decide to adopt, it's vitally important that you make a copy of the entire application bundle for your own records. This way, you'll always know the extent of the file which the Hong Kong ID hold on you for the purposes of future applications, and can save a great deal of second guessing if ever you find yourself needing to make any further applications to the department subsequently. This complete copy will be absolutely essential, too, if you need to make any kind of appeal as a result of your application being refused. In addition to making a copy of the entire application bundle in this way, where you're planning to submit your application in person, either directly on the floor of the Immigration Tower in question, or via 2nd floor receipt and dispatch, you should also make an extra copy of the application form, or just the cover letter, and request that the receiving officer stamp the application as received, which will serve to demonstrate that the Hong Kong ID did actually receive the application into their hands. Submissions have been known to be lost by the Hong Kong D on occasion, you know. And as we've discussed in detail on day 1, if you are in Hong Kong when you submit your application and you're holding a visitor visa, you need to ensure that you will have sufficient visitor visa status to cover the 6 to 8 weeks typical processing time. Otherwise, plan your movements into and out of Hong Kong carefully to avoid any preemptory challenges by the immigration officers at the boundaries, and as always, be aware of the Shenzhen shuttle. Assuming that you submit your application directly to the section in Immigration Tower which will be considering your application, the typical experience is to approach the submission counter, take a number, Be called over to the numbered counter within 35 to 40 minutes. There'll then be a perfunctory examination of the papers, mainly focusing on the complete and correct filling out of the relevant application forms, and then it's over. You'll be told to expect a response within 2 to 3 weeks, and that will come via mail or fax. And thereafter, you wait to be contacted. Once the application has been received by the department, it works its way through their system and is allocated a specific reference number. It's then subsequently tasked to an immigration officer who is given the primary responsibility for its consideration. The first communication you can expect will be a computer-generated card which officially acknowledges receipt of your application and sets out the allocated reference number. Depending on the application type, this usually arrives within about 10 days of the date of the first submission. That's the date of the Hong Kong ID actually first receiving the paperwork into its hands. Assuming that the Hong Kong ID then have more questions or are seeking further and better particulars in respect of your application, and indeed 99% of cases do fall into this category, you will receive an official letter, typically by fax, within a couple of weeks after the official receipt card has arrived. This letter will set out a laundry list of additional requirements if you've not submitted a comprehensive first submission or they perceive your application as a weak one. Or it'll just contain a few extra clarifications or updated documentation requests, which kind of indicates the possibility of a strong application. However, whatever request comes next, if it's not an approval, do not assume that you're well on your way to one. There's still a long way to travel just yet. You're usually afforded 2 to 3 weeks to respond to each of the requests for information, with the Hong Kong ID letter always setting out a date by which you have to respond. If you're unable to respond in accordance with these timelines, you should contact the officer directly, explain your need for further time, and agree an alternate date for their submission. If you don't arrange the next submission, drop dead date, or just let the time pass by and don't respond at all, the officer will likely finalise the application on the strength of the documents and representations that he has on hand, meaning it will almost certainly be denied. If the Hong Kong ID asks for something, do your absolute utmost to give it to them, by the date that they've requested it by. If you're in Hong Kong whilst your application is being considered, you might get a phone call out of the blue from the officer tasked with processing your case. He or she could have any kind of question to throw at you, so make sure that you know the ins and outs of your application and be ready for the possibility of such a call. It doesn't always happen that officers call applicants, preferring usually to communicate in writing, but sometimes officers do make such calls, especially if they wish to clear something up quickly or put the applicant on notice that another document will be required, which if delivered speedily could lead to a fast finalisation of your application. And when you do make a subsequent submission to the department, whether by fax or in person, and the second floor receipt and dispatch section, it's important to wait 48 hours and then call the officer to confirm that he or she has received it. A quick call only. It's not recommended that you inquire as to the likely outcome of your application, as they will not be drawn on this question. It's not the decision of a single officer as to approve or refuse, with stringent quality controls and checks and balances in place to ensure the department are making the right decisions. So please don't embarrass the officer by asking him directly of the chances of an approval or asking for a commitment to a set time frame. These things just have to work their way through the system, and it's not often that the Hong Kong ID get it wrong. As the toing and froing of the Hong Kong ID plays itself out, you use page 6 of the roadmap to keep an ongoing record of your interactions with them. Cases quite often do get to a third and fourth set of submission, so this is a useful tool to keep track of where you are and what's being requested. When your case has been finalised, you will receive an official notification from the Hong Kong ID in writing. If you've been approved, you will receive a letter which sets out the approval formalities. These will differ depending on your application type and how it was submitted. Some approval types, especially those in respect of a change of employer, do not actually require a next step by the applicant, so be guided by the clear directions included on the approval letter. The same approval letter will also set out your obligations to register for a Hong Kong ID card and how to go about doing this, especially if you're a new resident to Hong Kong or have changed immigration category, which requires an update in the Hong Kong ID card type that you carry. Either way, an approval is a happy event, and the issuance of Hong Kong ID cards is really just an administration process, quite different from the ongoing stress of formal case consideration, which, for some unfortunate applicants, may not be over quite just yet. If your case has been refused, you should refer to the refusals and appeals section of the Hong Kong Visa Handbook to determine your next step. And with that, I'm happy to say we've fully completed the entire 4-part series on the Hong Kong Visa Application Roadmap. Please remember, if you have any questions relating to your application, simply go to our blog, write them up on a no-name basis, and we'll endeavour to give you a podcast answer via our blog within 48 hours. All part of the service and completely free of charge to members of our mailing list. And yes, it really is the end. Thanks for taking the journey with me, Stephen Barnes, co-founder of the Hong Kong Visa Centre. I wish you all the best for your application, and please check out our website and our blog for a whole array of other great resources to assist you in your Hong Kong visa and immigration applications, all designed to help you help yourself and completely free of charge.